Good morning, friends. In Sunday's message, we saw our Lord describe some of the specific sins of the scribes and Pharisees that his own disciples and the rest of the people need to be careful to avoid. But we also saw, and will continue to see in the coming weeks, how these individual sins all spring up out of an underlying disposition of rebellion toward the Lord. And really, it is that essential baseline attitude of rebellion and a rejection of God that leads to ultimate judgment for anyone who remains in that state. And we'll unpack that truth more a bit later in the week as the Lord allows, even though I mention it now because I do want us to keep it in our active memory, even as we talk about a few other things. Because specifically for today, I want to point out something that I just didn't have time to get into this past Sunday. Because the first thing Jesus warns the people about concerning one of the specific sins of the scribes and Pharisees is that they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. And we talked about the illustration that Jesus is alluding to, about the teamster whose job it is to load up a caravan worth of pack animals, each with an appropriate amount of cargo, such as the weight is bearable, not only in terms of how much weight is put on the beast, but also how the weight is loaded, balanced and comfortable for the animal to bear. Because again, even if we want to assume that the teamster doesn't care about the animal on a personal level, which is probably an unfair assumption. But even if that was the case, they still aren't doing themselves any favors if they load the animal improperly. They end up wearing their animals out, perhaps even to the extent where they are useless as a pack animal. And that would cause that much more expense and delay to their endeavor. And so any good teamster, any good caravaner knows how to load their beasts of burden in an appropriate way. But Jesus points all of that out to then point to the scribes and Pharisees as being just the opposite of those good caravanners, because the scribes and Pharisees are overloading and burdening the people who sit under their teaching in ridiculous ways because of their legalistic view of a law of God, which actually completely sapped the law of all the underpinnings of love that God put in there. Through this legalistic attitude, especially where they added their own rules and regulations on top of those the Lord gave, they ended up heaping on the people a spiritual burden that was simply too great to bear. And then on top of that, they had no compassion for the people. They made no attempt to help the people bear that burden. Again, going back to the illustration of loading a pack animal, the scribes and Pharisees made no attempt to balance the weight or load it in a way that made it more bearable for the people. They didn't care. They were simply legalistic, demanding, and harsh. Rather than displaying love for God and love for their fellow man, even in this case, their fellow kinsmen, their fellow Jewish people, as the law would have them do, they put these massive burdens of excessive and pedantic rules on the people. And again, here I especially reference the rules and regulations that the scribes and Pharisees invented themselves and added to God's law. And then they scorned the people and rejected the people and considered the people to be less than if they dared to fail to live up to all those things they put on them. And it's when we think about this as the reality that existed in Israel at that time concerning the religious system and of the law as it existed then and how it was taught and what was added to it, that we then consider what Jesus says in Matthew 11. And what he says here becomes even more incredible than what I hope we already understand. Because at the end of Matthew 11, Jesus says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now, you don't need to know anything about what we've been talking about in Matthew 23 to to read what Jesus just said there at the end of Matthew 11 and to know that what Jesus says is good. To recognize that, yes, we want the rest that Jesus offers us here. But how much more so do we understand that when we think about the kind of system that the people were living in that day, in the legalism, the incredible crushing legalism of the scribes and Pharisees that was being put on them in that day. And then Jesus comes and says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Because the law, as the scribes and Pharisees presented it, again, with all their additions, was a high standard. And on the one hand, it's like, yes, God's law is a high standard. It requires perfection. But God's actual law had grace built into it. The sacrificial system was part of the law and built into the fabric, the core of the law. And that sacrificial system itself understood that the law was not going to be kept properly. And so the way of forgiveness, the way that pointed to an atonement that the people could not do themselves, was built into the law. Okay, and so, yes, it was God's law, but insofar as we're just focusing on the law that God gave and not the man-made additions, there was grace even within that law. But in the teachings and in the attitudes of the scribes and Pharisees, no such grace existed. You were either good enough or you would be scorned as a sinner. There was no mercy, no compassion, no grace. And so this system left the people who tried to follow it crushed under an inescapable load of despair. But then Jesus arrives preaching the truth with authority, reminding and teaching the people of the better way, the original way that involves grace that God always intended the people to live by. Okay, trusting in him for an atonement and for forgiveness that they could never earn themselves. And in that, through that atonement and in that forgiveness of sin, there is freedom from guilt, freedom from sin's punishment. And which is why Jesus is able to say, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Because coming to Jesus in this faith, as he calls people to do, trusting in him, is the way to be free from the law's curse. It's how we are set free from the despair of never being able to keep the law ourselves. Because as good and perfect and righteous as the law is, and it is, leastwise, again, insofar as we're talking about the actual law of God and not the man-made add-ons, but as good and holy as the law is, it can never save us. Not because the law is deficient, but because we are. The law is perfect, but we are flawed, deeply flawed due to sin. And therefore we cannot keep the law as we would need to in order to be declared innocent and righteous in our own ability. And since it's impossible to do so, then if we trust in any sort of legalism to save us, the result can only be despair. And if you've ever experienced real despair, or if you've ever allowed yourself to consider the reality of despair, that is the thing that crushes us and burdens us the most. That is what every other negative emotion, negative state of mind ends up leading us to: despair. And friends, let's understand that because of our sinful nature, and here we're gonna go beyond the scribes and Pharisees for a minute, but because of our own sinful nature, we are all conceived and born as natural legalists. Our default mindset is to try to be good enough and earn our salvation, even so much as to go so far as to demand that we are good enough just as we are. Therefore, God must save us, and a whole bunch of other things that must happen for us because we are good enough. For instance, and I know this is anecdotal in a sense, it's just one example out of who knows how many, but a movie I watched for the first time just a short while ago, even though it's been out for a while, is The Greatest Showman, a kind of fantastical retelling of the life of P.T. Barnum. and that famous circus. And the music in this movie is incredibly well done and emotionally stirring and powerful. And for that reason, I have to admit, I enjoy the music. But despite that, we need to be careful about not just the music here, but the music and the lyrics that our world brings to us. Because, as an example, there's lyrics in one song in The Greatest Showman that demonstrates exactly what I'm talking about here. I think, if I remember correctly, the one of the producers or whoever it was behind the scenes of the movie called this song the anthem of the movie. The song is called This Is Me. And in that song, we have the lines, "And I know that I deserve your love. There's nothing I'm not worthy of." Now think about those lines. And if you've seen the movie, you know the context, and that softens it a little bit. But really, this is the message of that anthem. I know that I deserve your love. There's nothing I'm not worthy of. Okay. Now, again, looking in the context of the movie and the emotion and all of that kind of stuff, we think about how wonderfully inspirational those words might seem to be. But let's think of them from a biblical perspective. The plain insinuation is that the singers and whoever's singing along is good enough, that we deserve, that we are worthy, just as we are. We have earned whatever it is that we are demanding. And therefore, the characters singing and whoever else is singing along can make a rightful demand to be loved and a rightful demand to be honored for all their worthiness. Do we see the legalism in this? There's no charity in these words. There's no humility in these words. There's no compassion or acknowledgement of where one might in truth be lacking something. No, it is a modern day anthem that says, I am good enough, therefore grant me my demands. That is legalism. But friends, it's a hollow demand based on a faulty premise, because none of us are worthy. None of us have deserved or earned anything good. Therefore, we have no right to demand anything good, because we have all rebelled against the God who created us, who is himself the only source of genuine goodness. And as long as we sing the songs and convince ourselves of their validity, I suppose we can live in that delusion for a time. But at some point, reality is going to shine through, and we are once again going to be crushed by the despair that legalism leads us to. Because we will realize, and maybe it'll only be on the day of judgment, but hopefully before then, we will realize that we are actually not worthy. And it all comes crumbling down, and we are crushed underneath the load of that legalism. But Jesus says, come to me. He's asking his people, he's really commanding the people who are listening to him to acknowledge reality, that they and we cannot save ourselves. And if we are willing to humble ourselves in a way that acknowledges our own inability, and then put our faith in him, just as he said in Matthew 23, if we are willing to humble ourselves, he will exalt us. He will lift us up. And it's the same thing here. If we are willing to humbly come to him in the knowledge that we are heavy burdened by legalism, it crushes us and we can't do it, he promises in his own power to set us free from that burden of despair, that he will give the true rest for our souls. And again, we compare these words to the harsh taskmasters that were the scribes and Pharisees, or the harsh taskmaster that is our own legalistic heart, which teaches us to hold on to those delusions, which eventually will come crashing down. And then we hear Jesus say, learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart. Don't learn from the harsh and prideful legalism of the scribes and Pharisees. Don't learn from your own heart, which will take legalism into delusion, which, yes, makes you feel good for a while, but then dumps you into fear and anxiety and even further despair. No, don't learn from those other sources. Learn from Jesus, for he is gentle. For he himself acts in humility and compassion and love, and he helps his people. Yes, he has a burden for us to bear for his sake, but he does not overload us. And it is a light burden compared to the despair of legalism. And even when it comes to that light burden, he knows how to load it on us so that it is bearable and easy rather than traumatic. And even then, he stays with us and he helps us with that burden, never leaving our side, but remaining with us always. So let us consider the light burden and the incredible compassion of the Lord Jesus Christ. And let us submit ourselves to him and acknowledge his incredible love and compassion over and against what we get from every other religious system in this world, including the delusions that our own hearts will lead us to. I love you guys. I pray you have a good and godly day. And Lord willing, I'll see you soon.